Welcome to the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Bill Hamblett, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings Magazine at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Friday, September 23rd, 2022. It's the first day that feels like fall here in the Annapolis, D.C. area. In Navy news this week, USNI News reports the trial for Seaman recruit Ryan Mays, the sailor accused of arson for the fire on board the USS Bonhomme Richard in 2020, began this week. In Westpac, the USS Higgins conducted a Taiwan Strait transit with the Royal Canadian Navy frigate HMCS Vancouver, and Leonard Francis, aka Fat Leonard, was arrested in Venezuela this week trying to flee to Russia after giving federal marshals and NCIS the slip 2 weeks ago while he was awaiting trial. Continuing our September aviation theme, my guest today is Lieutenant Commander Jeff Zeberline, a Navy F-18 pilot who is currently a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Most recently, he was the training officer of the world-famous Dam Busters of Strike Fighter Squadron 195, deployed to 5th Fleet in 2021 and 7th Fleet in 2022 on board the USS Ronald Reagan CVN 76. Jeff is a Top Gun graduate and has served at Strike Fighter Weapons School Pacific and also at Strike Fighter Squadron 2. Jeff is the author of the September Proceedings article, The Expeditionary Air Wing, a diplomatic role in peacetime, making the point that in this time of great power competition, Navy F-18s and carrier air wings can play an expanding diplomatic role. Jeff, welcome to the show. Thanks for writing for Proceedings.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on the show.
Okay, so start off, what spurred you to write this article?
Yeah, so I think I was interested to write this article because I felt like there was something missing from the conversation and debate amongst many other articles I've read regarding our competition with China. There's lots of good stuff out there, especially in Proceedings, about how we must prepare to win the possible war against China. And there's also a fair amount of very interesting articles on how we can kind of counter their gray zone tactics under the topic of maritime counterinsurgency. But I didn't feel like I had seen much about kind of what we should be doing before war occurs and in kind of more of a peacetime context. Kind of what should our peacetime focus and tactics be prior to armed conflict? So the big piece there is, of course, deterrence. It's the major kind of concept there, integrated deterrence having been introduced by SecDef Austin. And ultimately, that's what we want, right? We want to deter China and deter other actors from altering the status quo, especially with force. But it's a big topic that's kind of hard to pin down, and we can talk about more how this might help accomplish that. But to kind of get to the question you asked, I was looking to kind of express an idea about how F-18s and the carrier air wing could participate in that threshold below war, and this article is a result of that.
So one of the things you write is that diplomatic use of the aircraft carrier's symbolic power has atrophied over the past 20 years. How so?
Yeah, so I think this is a claim that I admittedly probably should have been a bit more specific about. I think the symbolic power of a carrier can manifest in many ways, and diplomacy is also a term that can mean different things depending on where you sit. So there were a couple things I had in mind when I wrote that. The first is kind of the simple notion that we've been bogged down in the Middle East for a long time. We just ended our 20-year war in Afghanistan last year, and for nearly the entire 20 years, there was an unbroken chain of carriers present in 5th Fleet. And so for better or for worse, the preponderance of our use of carriers for 2 decades has been to combat terrorism in that region. There have been some opportunities during that time to work with partners nearby, depending on where the carrier was located. But it always took a back seat to combat missions, and rightfully so. I'm not trying to claim that while we're at war, our primary mission should be to be diplomatic. No, of course, it's to win the fight. It's to support the troops on the ground, provide them with the firepower they're going to need so they can accomplish their mission. So when I say the diplomatic use of the carrier has atrophied, I mean initially that it really just hasn't been the focus of our mission for a long time. The second is that my focus of this article was really more on the carrier air wing itself and what it can provide to partner nations and allies through diplomacy. So, it's true that the carrier has often been involved in diplomacy, and even over the past 20 years. And this kind of through its symbolic presence near countries or regions that needed it, right? Through port calls, maybe official visits that have provided those face-to-face interactions for our governments. And those things are crucial. And sometimes it can be kind of hard to know what impact that has. Kind of as one quick example, on my first deployment in 2017 on the USS Carl Vinson, we were sent off the coast of North Korea to deter their missile tests and deter their progress towards getting a nuclear bomb, right? So this was also in the first few months of the Trump presidency, and I may never know really if or how the carrier's presence off the coast of North Korea influenced North Korean decision making, or perhaps it bolstered the efforts of our high-level diplomats to negotiate the bilateral meetings that President Trump eventually had with Kim Jong-un, right? But if the carrier's presence did have an impact, then that is certainly the kind of diplomatic power the carrier can project around the world, and I think is what most people think of when they think of kind of carrier diplomacy. And so that's crucial. But when I wrote about diplomatic atrophy, I was more referring to the kinds of activities that the carrier air wing can accomplish on a more personal diplomatic basis and through training. And so that's where I looked to history a bit and kind of read about and heard about, how often carriers used to send their aircraft into foreign countries to train with partners and allies. And that piece has waned a lot over the years. I've talked to some who are kind of further along in their careers, former COs or XOs or department heads. And they've talked about detachments they did when they were JOs or their friends did, and about the interesting experiences they had flying with pilots of other countries. And, I mentioned in the article about how CAG-8 had detached to 3 different countries on their deployment in 2001, and were on their way home just prior to getting turned around to kind of start the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11. And there were other examples I found in the early 2000s where, Navy jets participated in Cope Tiger, for example, which is an annual exercise in Thailand. But these stories over time, they got fewer and farther between as the war on terror grew. And now I should also mention that, I wrote this at the beginning of this year, at the start of 2022, and already this year, it seems like we've started to change these tides a bit, which I think is really encouraging. And I know friends and colleagues who have deployed to 6th Fleet this year who did a lot of flying with foreign pilots, and it seems like those were hugely beneficial exercises in terms of building trust and interoperability among allies and kind of using the carrier air wing to establish diplomacy. And I'd just like to see that revived and increased a bit more in 7th Fleet.
Gotcha. So I remember back my first deployment, I was the intel officer with an F-18 squadron, USS Theodore Roosevelt. She was the newest carrier in the fleet in 1988, 89. We deployed to the Mediterranean for 6 months. And guys in my squadron and the air wing did exactly what you're describing in this article, right? I remember I went to a little air base in northern Spain where 2 F-18s from our squadron did this ACM detachment for about 3 or 4 days with Spanish F-18s, for example. And then later on, a couple of guys from my squadron, spent a few days in Israel, actually doing some interesting air-to-ground, air-to-mud stuff with the Israeli Air Force, F-16s, et cetera. So this kind of thing, as you point out, it was de rigueur, back in the 80s and 90s, and probably went the wayside. Because of 9/11, because of the fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, which became the main focus for so long, but time to get back to that. Did you do any of this kind of thing during your deployment to 5th Fleet on Ronald Reagan, either in 2021 or in 7th Fleet in 2022, earlier this year?
Yeah, so honestly, not enough in my opinion, and not much of the type of diplomacy or training that I'm specifically advocating for. So, sure, we did do bilateral and multilateral exercises in the traditional sense of carrier diplomacy I was describing. So in 2021, on our way to 5th Fleet, we sailed with Singapore, and we got photos next to their ships, flying with or sailing with them. On our way back from that deployment, passing through India, I got to actually fly in a photo X with 4 other Indian flankers and an Indian P-8. And we also did a very large kind of historic multilateral with countries like Japan and the UK, who sent their carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, may she rest in peace. And we did get some good training for a couple days with the Carl Vinson there and the QE2, where we simulated attacks on their carrier and vice versa. In 2022, in 7th Fleet, I was only on half of that deployment. The Reagan is back out to sea now, and we were planning some great training events that unfortunately for one reason or another just didn't quite pan out the way we hoped. And I think that's one challenge. Is I certainly don't claim it's easy to coordinate the efforts of a carrier schedule with foreign countries, but I'd really like to see more training and integration with our partners be made the primary mission, at least for some meaningful portion of a deployment. And again, kind of with a focus on what the air wing is accomplishing, not just using the carrier's presence.
That's a great point. You've got a good quote from Admiral Aquilino, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, in your article. Can you read that for our listeners and just, put that into the context of your thinking?
Yeah, sure. So in the article, I quoted his prepared remarks from the Halifax International Security Forum in November of 2021. And he wrote, quote, "It is critically important that the global set of like-minded allies, partners, and friends work together to support our common values," end quote. And that was a huge theme of his entire speech as he spoke to high-ranking members of over 70 nations. And I thought it was just kind of a great representation of what many people in our chain of command, all the way from the top, President Biden, Secretary Austin have emphasized, and he have emphasized about the importance of building integrated deterrence. And I think you see that written in the interim strategic defense guidance, the forthcoming national defense strategy, which is published but not released, unclassified yet anyway. And so I think you see that all the way from the top. And I think it just kind of represented the notion of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, great points. And, to that integration point, it's great to have allies and partners, but the real strength there is actually being able to interoperate with them, right?
Yes.
You can't just, sail next to them and have the photo op. You actually have to do hard, difficult training. You got to be honest with each other. You got to be able to, trust each other as wingmen, that you're going to show up, that you understand each other, that you brief and you debrief together, et cetera.
Exactly.
One of the things that jumped out at me in your article is that you mentioned a number of benefits of international air exercises at the tactical, the operational, and the strategic level. And you were the training officer for the Dam Busters, and keeping, particularly on deployment, keeping aviators completely, trained up for all the different missions, air to air, air to mud, anti-surface warfare, all these different things. That's hard after you've left Fallon and after you've left the home ranges of the United States. So talk a little bit about at the tactical level, the individual aircrew and squadron level. What are some of the benefits that you see coming from some of these air exercises that you're advocating for?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of benefits, and this is where I've had tons of fun just kind of talking with and imagining with friends and other tactics instructors about kind of what great training we could get, if we just attached a portion of our air wing to bases on foreign countries. So at the tactical level, one benefit, having some aircraft on land and others on the carrier, would help mitigate some of the trouble we have when we set up our fights. When we set up a training event, we typically have to fly long distances in the opposite direction before we can turn around and face each other. And that's because we all start from the same spot in the ocean, on the carrier. And those things, that takes time and gas away. And when you're doing these high-end training events, time and gas is precious. We do see those benefits when we have dual carrier ops, as one can play blue and one carrier can play red, but we don't always have two carriers available. So splitting up our forces by detaching them would accomplish that same goal on foreign soil. I think it would also be very beneficial to the realism of our training to have not every aircraft be of the same type, not have all F-18s versus all F-18s. So if we could get foreign navies and air forces to kind of participate with us from their bases, we could enhance the realism of our training a little bit. I also think just at the individual training level for the people on the carrier and the ships in the carrier strike group, the destroyers and cruisers, it would help their training a lot at the individual level, because they would have to detect oncoming forces and react appropriately, rather than kind of getting to be able to cheat and watch them kind of take off from where they are, fly many miles away, and then turn around. So I think it would certainly improve the training to more realistic rules of engagement and alert launch timelines. On the air to surface side, being able to train to close air support in a foreign country on ranges that allow bombs to be dropped on actual targets that we can discriminate with, using qualified JTACs, would allow us to accomplish training that often goes neglected during long non-combat deployments. There's as you mentioned, there's an intense and comprehensive training syllabus that we use to create section leads, and air to surface missions often get paused when we're on deployment just for sheer lack of ranges. So that could be a huge benefit as well. But probably the best part, and perhaps the most underappreciated part, when talking about training at the individual level and that interoperability with our partners, is the ability to debrief together after a mission. So I know it sounds boring, but I can promise I speak for almost all patch wearers when I say, the debrief is probably the most important part of any training mission. If you just go up there and fly around, come back and just high five, you'll never know how well you did or where you need to improve. So when we land on the boat without getting to meet the people we're flying with, those foreign pilots, or get to talk in depth about how the training went, we're not really learning from our mistakes or improving on the ability to integrate in the future. And yes, we can mitigate that with a phone call or an email, but it's just not the same. So I think the benefits of face-to-face interaction with other pilots that we would fly with is enormous. And I think it would foster much more trust between our militaries if we were able to make that happen on a regular basis.
Yeah, one of our regular listeners, Austere Roberto, he also picked up on that. He said, "Love the easy fixes like debriefing together." To your point, when you're operating with somebody that you're not normally operating with, you get a different perspective. And if they're flying an F-16, or if they're flying, a Super A-10 Dart, I'm probably dating myself a little bit, but they're flying different airplanes, right, than you are. That's instead of just fights on and you're fighting Super Hornet to Super Hornet, you're fighting something different that turns differently, that maneuvers differently, that has a different weapons envelope, et cetera. There's value in that. So
Absolutely.
Thanks for that point, Austere Roberto. Yeah, we're repeat offender. Well put. So Jeff, what are some of the benefits at the operational level or within the region that you see? And I know you've already touched on some of this. It just gets to that cohesion with allies and partners, but just build on that a little bit if you would.
Yeah, for sure. And within the region, I think it's crucial. Again, we're gearing up for a potential fight with an adversary whose military size and capability we just have not faced before. So if that were to happen, kind of God forbid, we're going to need all the help we can get. So fostering these relationships now, meeting people, interacting with them, training with them, I think those things will be crucial later on. I'll tell you, like, even after 10 years of flying, I can still be a little bit uncomfortable when I'm arriving at an airfield or a base I've never been to. It's just part of that unknown. But imagine a scenario where we built those relations ahead of time, and now all of a sudden we're in conflict, and maybe I have to divert to the Philippines, for example, or maybe Singapore or Vietnam. The ability to have a level of comfort of having kind of been there before maybe even flown with somebody at that base who can kind of be a familiar face when you land would be crucial. And you extend that familiarity to the potential benefits if we actually needed to operate out of those bases or countries. You think about the logistics of how a potential conflict would go. We don't have American soil nearby except for the carrier, right? So if that gets kind of taken out of the equation, or perhaps you have to divert, you have an emergency, or you take battle damage or something like that, maybe you have to go land in a foreign country. And so I think getting everybody used to that is one aspect of how it's going to benefit us at the operational level. The other is, again, kind of what I mentioned about improving the quality of training, both for us and our partners. So any effort we can make now to improve the substantive capabilities of our partners is going to increase our operational advantage if full-scale war does indeed happen. So, it's obvious that we're going to be playing that away game. And so we need our partners to increase their capabilities. And if we have the ability to help them do that, that's going to be hugely beneficial. And I think the F-18 is particularly suited well amongst our nation's air assets to do that, as it was designed to be kind of the jack of all trades. And, we train to just about every type of mission. So we can support them in kind of whatever mission they're comfortable training with us, we can do. And you practice those simple things and work up to more complex training. That's going to greatly improve our operational advantage should we have to go to war.
Yeah, I'm having flashbacks to being the intelligence officer and doing the TV briefs, the civic briefs for aviators before they flew in on that Med deployment, and then another one where we went through the Med in 1997. The divert fields in Spain, the divert fields in Italy, in Sardinia, in Greece, in the Eastern Med, right? And having to brief all that stuff. You bring up some good points. Just the fact that you're operating out of places that you haven't been before. There's always value. There's training. There's interoperability that just comes with that. And it seems pretty mundane when you think about it at the strategic level, but at the tactical level, you actually have to have that familiarity. You have to have been there. You have to know people who've been there. Your wingman's been there, or your flight lead's been there. They can impart some of that experience to you. It's a great point. Duncan Stewart makes a point that live fire in Korea has resumed after 3 years. So we had stopped doing live U.S. military and U.S. ROC military exercises. That was part of the, not putting the right term on it, but the charm offensive of the previous administration. So we made the promise to the North Koreans that we wouldn't do live exercises, but we're back to live exercises. So that possibly opens up some of those training ranges in the ROC to other carrier air wings in the future. And also, Duncan, I mentioned Med Cruise 88. I was wrong. Our Med Cruise was in 1989, early 89 on the Theodore Roosevelt. So I missed you by about a year there. But Jeff, I want to change subjects for a minute. I was out at Tailhook with Ward last 2 weeks ago. And at the Tailhook Symposium in Reno, there was a panel discussion about the making of Top Gun. It was great. They had, because all that footage was shot 3 plus years ago, which is interesting. The movie just came out because of COVID. It was held. But they had, the Navy advisor. They had Chaser Keithley, who's the president of the Tailhook Association, who had, I think, a great deal of influence on the making of the movie. They had a number of aviators who flew in the movie itself. And they mentioned, one of the things that they mentioned was that when they went to Fallon or they went to Lemoore and they flew scenes, that they didn't just open it up for senior pilots, that they essentially put out like a base-wide call for JOs. Hey, if you're available and you want to fly in the movie, come fly. So I know you were at Lemoore, so I had to ask, were you stationed in Lemoore at the time, and did you get to fly in any scenes in the movie Top Gun Maverick?
Oh man, I wish. No, unfortunately, I did not. As you mentioned, this movie was delayed by 2 years, and so they actually began filming some of like the initial scenes and getting the actors familiar with flying in those scenes while I was going through Top Gun about almost 4 years ago. I was at the time a little too focused on getting through the class. But after that, I was stationed in Lemoore at the weapons school. Unfortunately, we don't own our own aircraft, so we
Yeah.
were not always called upon to participate in that. But I do have some friends who flew many of the scenes, and I'm very jealous of their experience. They have a lot of cool stories, and some of them actually even became pretty decent friends to this day with some of the actors. So they've got some cool stories. I wish I could have been a part of that.
Yeah, the stories that they told in that panel discussion were really terrific, and I'm pretty sure that the Tailhook Association recorded that session from Tailhook, and I think it's up on their website. So if you've got the time, go to tailhook.found. I think it's tailhook.org. You can probably find that. It's just some really interesting stories about on the Navy side and on the cinematography side for the air-to-air missions. What they said. I was one thing that I just wanted to pass on because it was I'm talking to a JO here, and the guy that was in charge on the Hollywood side of flying, they had a specially equipped jet that had this gimbal camera that you could change the lenses and the filters while they were airborne, so you didn't have to land and change lenses and all that stuff. And a very accomplished pilot, civilian pilot. But he mentioned that just how impressed he was with Navy JO aviators, because they would go and they would brief and they would say, look, this is what we want to accomplish with this particular mission, this particular flight. Here's what we're looking to this is what we want this scene to look like in the movie. And JOs would go, got it. They'd brief, they'd go fly it. They'd come back and be like, yep, got it. And then move on to the next scene. He said it was just amazing how professional and organized and just terrific aviators, all the JOs were. And he said, we weren't working with all former Blue Angels. We're working with just, your fleet average JO who would show up and be ready for the flight, and they would go and they'd execute the mission and get it done. And, they would capture the image or the scene. And it was like, okay, we're on to the next scene. So that was, I thought, just a really, sort of resounding compliment from Hollywood, from somebody who makes movies to the Navy, which was just terrific. We're running a little bit short on time, so I wanted to ask you for if you've gotten any feedback on your article yet from your colleagues, your wingmen, and any other points you might want to make about naval aviation in general, how grad school is treating you. You're out of the cockpit now. You're studying grand strategy and international politics. So the floor is yours for a couple minutes here.
Grad school is exciting for me personally, but I'm not sure. I don't bore your listeners with with what I'm doing in grad school. I have gotten a little bit of feedback from people who've read it, and I think a lot of people that I've talked to, both before and after it was published, have said that they'd love to see this kind of idea happen in the future. And I don't think it takes much to convince a lot of people that there's an idea here where we get to fly off of the boat for a period of time during deployment. I mean, everyone's just looking to get off the boat once they're on it. On my article and idea, I guess the one thing that I just probably didn't express enough in the article is just that, I think I'm encouraged by where things are headed. As I said, I originally wrote this at the beginning of this year. And at that time, I didn't see much kind of movement in the direction of prioritizing air wing integration during these foreign training events. So, and I think perhaps some of that delay, especially when you talk about sending people off the ship, was due to just a risk averse, bringing COVID back on board the ship for the past 2 years, and so I think that kind of set us back. I think, but I know a lot of people have been wanting to do this, and so even just this year, we've made good steps in this direction. As we did in 6th Fleet earlier this year, I think we just need to make these efforts a higher priority in the Indo-Pacific, and I know there are a lot of great people, friends who are working very hard on air wing staffs and CSG staffs who kind of want to see these integration efforts happen. And I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to participate in my next squadron.
Yeah, you make a good point about COVID and the impacts that had I talked to a couple of JOs from one of the VAQ squadrons that had been deployed on the Carl Vinson earlier this year. They had done, I think they said, a 10-month deployment, and they had a grand total of 4 days in port, and all of them were in Guam. So U.S. territory in Guam, and that was the extent of their, foreign liberty on a 10-month deployment, which is almost unthinkable to me. I wanted to throw out a couple of things. We got 2 more questions from Austere Roberto. One was any smart insights into China's economy so far from Johns Hopkins. So you can pass on that one, or you can tackle it if you want. And the other one is he asked a question about AETP engines.
Okay, I wish I could answer those. I don't know that I'm qualified yet. I do plan this semester. It's been tough to get into certain classes. One of the classes I wanted to get into was on Chinese foreign policy and Chinese political economy. They have more options available in the spring, so I'll get back to him on that one.
Good.
The next question I'm unfamiliar with. Is that the
I'm not sure what the AET. Yeah, I didn't recognize that either. That's not the engine in the Super Hornet. I don't think it's the engine. It's not the engine in the F-35 either. So I'm not
At least
sure.
That's not how we refer to it as. So I was just not recognizing it right now.
Got it. No problem. No problem. Well, our guest today has been Lieutenant Commander Jeff Zeberline, U.S. Navy F-18 Super Hornet pilot, Top Gun graduate. He's the author of an article titled "The Expeditionary Air Wing: A Diplomatic Role in Peacetime," which appears in the September issue of Proceedings. Jeff, thanks so much for being on the show. I hope you'll come visit us soon in Annapolis.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and I'll definitely make that happen soon.
Fantastic. Okay, that wraps up another episode of the Proceedings podcast brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute. If you enjoy the show, like us and subscribe to our channel. Tell your friends, become a member of the Naval Institute at usni.org/join. Until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.